You're listening to the Art of Procurement episode 140, and the Art of Procurement is powered by PalmBridge, the strategic procurement on-demand business that I co-founded earlier this year. And a couple of weeks ago, we actually launched the PalmBridge Sourcing Power Pack. So it's an easy, low-risk way to test drive our ecosystem-driven model while accessing the subject matter expertise you need when you need it. So to learn more, check us out at palmbridge.com.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. Today's show is actually a little bit different, but it's a topic that I'm passionate about, as you'll hear in the interview itself. I'm actually joined by two guests today. First, I'm joined by Jim Baehr. So Jim is group lead for Sourcing Strategies Group. And through roles both in consulting and as a procurement leader, Jim has helped a number of organizations through procurement transformation initiatives. And I was initially connected to Jim through Jack Miles, my lead advisor at Art of Procurement and PalmBridge, and a former guest of the show. And then joining Jim is Mike Urick. Mike is graduate director and assistant professor at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And today's show is based on Jim and Mike's work in exploring the future of work, but more specifically, intergenerational differences. And I won't give too much away in the introduction, but we dive into a conversation about the myths and the realities when it comes to workforce labels, and specifically the labeling of generations such as millennials and baby boomers. You know, I'm always really skeptical when I read articles that suggest the answer to all of procurement's problems is to wait for the more traditional procurement practitioners to retire, heralding in this new generation. And so I explore in the show, do intergenerational differences actually exist? And if so, what can procurement leaders do to harness intergenerational teams while preparing for the talent shortage that's projected once baby boomers do start retiring in large numbers? So it's a really interesting discussion, but what I'll do is I'll stop talking in my intro and let's roll the tape. So hi there, everybody, and today, as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm joined by Jim Baehr and Mike Urick. Jim, Mike, thanks for joining me and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, I'm going to start with a question for you, and I ask this question to a lot of practitioners that I interview. Did you choose procurement? Did it choose you?
Oh, wow. An interesting question.
Yeah.
It actually chose me.
Right.
My background was I came up through the old telephone company, spent the latter portion of my career in sales, which I enjoyed very much, then went into IT management. I was at Baehr in IT management when I was tapped on the shoulder and I was basically told that I was moving into strategic sourcing.
Right.
And it's been a great experience ever since.
No, and it's interesting, Jim, that you say that, because I find that a lot of people, myself included, we didn't really know what procurement was or didn't choose it, but ended up being placed there in some way, shape, or form and kind of fell in love with it and never left. That's definitely what happened to me.
Well, for me, it was an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I know I gave a little bit about your background in the introduction, but I noticed when I was researching that you'd been on the board, and perhaps you're still on the board of directors at ISPEM Pittsburgh. And at first look, it didn't seem to match with a lot of your experiences. So I was really interested, how did you get involved in ISPEM, and I think by association, the procurement and supply chain profession itself?
So it's kind of interesting. You're right. It does kind of stand out as being unique with regard to my other experiences. It started actually, and I still am on the board, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm vice president, incoming first vice president next year. But I was working at a university in Pittsburgh, and I was doing I was involved with their outreach arm, and so I was doing sort of training and development for a lot of organizations around the Pittsburgh area. And one of the programs, and I did have, I came from an auditing background where I used to audit the purchasing function, the procurement function as an internal auditor. And so I was interested in purchasing and procurement for quite some time. But one of my programs I was assigned to as a program manager at this training and development center was a purchasing certificate. And so I became interested in that area through sort of administering that program. I wasn't the instructor for the program, but I was more administering that certificate program.
Okay.
And became very interested in the topic, and we worked extensively as we were putting together and revising that program with ISM Pittsburgh. And as a result, got to know the profession a little bit more, got to know especially the people of ISM Pittsburgh. And at the time, they had asked me to then join the board. And basically, not so much as the traditional purchasing professional,
right,
but as someone with some ties to academia, with some ties to training and development. And they wanted that perspective on the board. So that was a while ago. I took a break from the board for several years, and then whenever I moved back to Pittsburgh, I lived out of the area for some time, moved back to Pittsburgh, they asked me to rejoin to basically fill out my term, and I've been basically doing that for several years since then. And so very happy to work with such a great group of people.
Yeah, and it makes more sense now. When I was looking, I was thinking, that's kind of strange in terms of how it connects with a lot of your background, but definitely makes sense from the academia perspective. And I know that you've spent a lot of time researching labeling in the workforce. I saw a couple of blog posts specifically to it when I was doing some research, but I know, you've spent a lot more time in your career doing that. I was interested, why is that something that's so much of interest to you?
Yeah, it is very interesting. I spend a lot of time, I've been researching this probably for nearly a decade now.
Right.
And a lot of the blog posts that I post, particularly on St. Vincent College's website, where I work, are related to intergenerational interactions or labels in the workplace. And the reason why I think it's so important is I recall whenever I was in training and development, and we used to have some programs related to generational differences in the workplace. And I remember reading some of the material that the instructor would use and thinking, this doesn't really relate to my experiences. This is not what I've seen in the workplace at all. These are sort of stereotypes associated with particular labels. Now, I'm not sure that this is really academically supported. I don't know how real these stereotypes are at describing people of certain age groups. And I recalled earlier in my career as an auditor sitting through similar trainings and just being frustrated with them by thinking, this isn't the way we're talking about age in the workplace, the way we're talking about generations in the workplace by giving these labels and focusing on stereotypes is really missing the mark. And whenever I decided to start researching this, moving on to another career change as a more full-fledged academic as a professor, I started researching this, and I realized as I got more and more into it, there wasn't a lot of really data support for some of these stereotypes that we talk about regularly. And that intrigued me, and I wanted to know, well, what is it? Why are we still talking about it? It's really the strength of the label, I think, that has just gotten so caught up in our discourse in both the workplace and society that we just assume that these stereotypes exist, perhaps.
That they mean something that they don't.
And so that's why I got into it. I was doing some consulting with a Chamber of Commerce where I was living at the time, and it was for a leadership development program. So young professionals emerging as leaders, as managers in their organization. And we were basically just assessing how well this chamber was doing with regard to leadership development. But we had a couple of, we had a survey, we had a couple of open-ended questions at the end. And one of the open-ended questions said something like, what is your biggest challenge at work? And many, it was several respondents said, I can't talk to somebody that's a different age from me. I can't talk to somebody who's older. And I was intrigued by that. I was scratching my head, and I'm thinking, wow, this is a big problem. We're getting it wrong as we're delivering training because we're relying a lot on labels and stereotypes. And people are still having challenges with regard to interacting with other age groups. So there's something here. There's something we need to examine a little bit more. And that's why I got interested in it.
Right. Why do you think we actually do label? Are we just afraid, or are we being lazy?
Well, people, it's almost natural for humans to do this, I think. People like to make sense of their surroundings. People actually like, I don't want to call it lazy, but they like shortcuts to creating an understanding of what's going on around them. And so labels sort of create this cognitive shortcut. Oh, okay, I see this person is of this age group, and so they must be this, and that explains their behavior, or that explains their values. It simplifies the world around us a little bit in our workplace, and so it's kind of human nature for us to do this.
So I know that, Jim, you talked about the fact you've more of a kind of a corporate procurement background. How did you both end up teaming up to kind of look at the impact? When we talk about labels, I think specifically today we want to talk about generational differences. How did you kind of partner to look at that, and why focus on procurement?
Pittsburgh is, or has been over the years, a large hub of chemical commerce. Mm-hmm. And there's a well-established event here called Pittsburgh Chemical Day. And I was part of that event for many, many years before shifting my allegiances to ISM. And the folks at Pittsburgh Chemical Day came back, and because Pittsburgh Chemical Day addresses both sales, purchasing, and it also addresses operations, mm-hmm. they came back and asked, would we be interested in doing some presentations for them as part of the program? And we said yes. And on our second go-around, which was about 3 years ago, we had presented the topic of Workforce 2020 mm-hmm. because we had recognized already that the workforce was changing dramatically and it would have significant impact on the chemical industry. And the folks there at the event who were in charge of the program said, yes, we would very much like to have you address this. Mike, myself, and a couple of other folks came together as part of a team. And Mike and I both have something of a passion for this topic, but I had the wrong passion at the time. And we came together and started crafting the draft of the presentation. Mm-hmm. And candidly, I was a labeler. I was a stereotyper, at least for this topic. I've always tried to stay away from that in my business career. Mm-hmm. I was taught very well. But in this particular case, I started using the term millennials and baby boomers, and they do this and they do that. Right. And Mike and I had not necessarily a heated argument, but a very active exchange where we went back and forth, where Mike challenged me and said, that's wrong. You're labeling people. You shouldn't be doing that. Mm-hmm. And because I was on shaky ground, it was a contradiction of my own personality. He won the argument. He was also a lot more intelligent in his presentation of the argument than I was.
He had the data to back it up.
Yes, I backed off, and we crafted a presentation that changed me, and it changed me for many reasons. My experiences were to the contrary. Mm-hmm. And we took this first stab at it, and it was very, very well received. The presentation was called Workforce 2020, and people were really interested in Mike's view about these labels, the intergenerational differences. They're, in some cases, in a lot of cases, contrived. They're not what we think they are. So we've worked together since then, and Mike had proposed last year that we present to ISM at the conference in Orlando, which we did. And Mike, I'll let you take it from there if you want to add something.
Sure. Yeah, we were both on the board of ISM Pittsburgh, and we had talked about generational issues at several meetings. And like Jim said, we had, I think, initially some different perspectives on the topic. But as we continue to discuss, we grew to sort of, I think, learn from each other and decided to, we both were coming from different backgrounds. Mine from more academic research, and Jim's more from the practical side of things, actually living this. And I thought, this is a good collaboration here. We can take some of the data that I've been collecting and draw on some of the publications that I've been writing, and then compare and contrast them with Jim's experiences, and maybe deliver some content to folks that might be both practical and grounded in research to try and dispel some of the myths about generations.
So, are generational differences? I think we're touching on the fact that a lot of them, you just said there, are some myths. Is there some reality to? Are the differences between generations, or is the vast majority of it really just perceived?
To be honest and frank, if you look at the research, some researchers say there are generational differences in some areas. A lot of researchers say some of those are exaggerated. I just finished up a project that's going to be published towards the end of summer or early fall. And actually it looks at differences within a generation. And we're particularly studying what's been labeled the millennial generation. And in it, we see a lot of variability with regard to what those individuals value within that generational label. And so it's tough for me to say there are clear differences between generations. Now, that said, it's an interesting question, and one that I get asked a lot. I know that generational differences are perceived because people talk about them, so they perceive them to exist. In terms of, are there really clear, concrete differences other than just perceptions? It's tough to answer, but my response is I don't really care.
Right.
And the reason why I don't really care is I know that people perceive there are differences. I know that people in their perceptions are having hard times interacting with each other. And that's what I care about. So that if we can improve these interactions more so that our people in the organizations can communicate with each other better, that's where I want to be. So this whole notion of are there differences, are there not, it kind of goes out the window there. People perceive them to exist, and they're causing troublesome interactions. So let's focus on what we can do to resolve these interactions, these problematic interactions.
Right. And Jim, I'm interested from your perspective, obviously on the corporate side, you mentioned that it was something that perhaps earlier in your career, you kind of just take that, the label, and you kind of run with it because that's what you're being conditioned to think about, the stereotype based on generations. I mean, did you see an impact of that in the workplace?
Well, Phil, I really didn't. I grew up into absolutely wonderful companies, and I was taught very well within those companies to focus on the task at hand and filter out all the noise from the background. And in this particular case, in my particular case, is it would happen. In my case, I see intergenerational differences. I experience them, but I believe they're greatly influenced by the noise. And there's more noise now than ever before. With access to social media, to the internet, to so many publications, it's coming at people from a lot of different directions.
Right.
And people tend to believe the noise before they will trust their eyes and their own personal experiences. And therefore, I would say that intergenerational differences are real and will always be real. One generation is different than the next.
Yeah.
But where we are right now, people are so distracted, and those distractions caused by all the different information coming from so many different sources, they're letting that influence their behaviors, and it's probably the worst possible time to allow that to happen because of the major shift in the workforce that will be taking place within this next decade.
Yeah, something that's interesting to me, I think about my experiences, and we talk about intergenerational differences, and often cited now as millennials. But when I was earlier in my career, and it's not, maybe it was 15 years ago, I always felt the same. I felt that I was pretty young. I was quite fortunate, I'd say, to have some senior roles at relatively young age, but I always felt that I was fighting against the process or the system, and that people looked at my age as something that would count against me rather than, kind of disregarding it. And I'm not sure if that was kind of the reality, whether that was just the narrative that I told myself. But I mean, it's no different, I think, from the differences that we hear people talking about today. So it's not necessarily that just generation, X generation the millennial generation, Generation Z, have those issues. I think that's just something that's a challenge for any emerging professional. The other thing is that I can't help but to read articles and books, and there's always this talk about understanding the millennial worker, but also saying that for procurement to really push ahead and to make true on what our new value proposition is, it really relies on baby boomers retiring from the workforce and these millennials coming through. To me, I mean, that's just, age is completely irrelevant, I think. What's new procurement? Yeah, what's old procurement? It's about mindset to me. And there'll be some millennials that don't understand, and there'll be baby boomers who completely get it. And we shouldn't necessarily be looking at people and labeling them based on generation. This is my perspective anyway, because it's the mind, it's what you're thinking about, how you're seeing the future.
So I think that's dangerous thinking regardless of which end of the spectrum you're on, because I had just mentioned that we're moving very rapidly into a decade of change when a lot of the deep smarts people will be moving out the door. And if businesses large and small don't recognize the importance of conducting knowledge transfer, completing knowledge transfer sooner rather than later, then they're going to find themselves at a very serious disadvantage. Every new generation has to learn from the older generation, and every new generation brings to the equation new skills, new talents, and that's especially true for emerging professionals today, where they are so technologically savvy, and that is so beneficial to the workforce. Now, if you blend all those deep smarts, as I like to call them, with all this technological savvy and all these new skills and ideas, you have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
The challenge is to bring the thinking together rather than allow it to be pulled apart, as many organizations are dealing with. And that's because so many organizations are reading the articles, the books, the media that you mentioned before that say, fix this. You have to fix the millennials. No, it's not about fixing. It's about focusing on the job at hand.
I will say that you talked about your own personal narrative, and I think that's key, is to, maybe there are some general tendencies between certain age groups, but as you point out, some of this is just shifts in society. That's not necessarily different values or behaviors that are fundamental to a particular age group, but they're just responding to this sort of progression of technology and progression of the way work is done. And, any generation who's experiencing that may sort of evolve along with that as well. There's a lot of talk about whether generations should really be looked at more as a maturity basis.
Yeah.
So in other words, did baby boomers behave the same way the millennials did when they were that age? There's other talk that suggests that generations should really only be viewed in sort of the, where they fall. So in other words, you constantly interact with the generation above you and the generation below you, and you're finding ways to engage in those generations. And so to that extent, the same challenges are going to continue over and over and over, regardless of particular labels. So in other words, you're going to see perhaps some challenging interactions decades from now, even though the labels may have changed.
Yeah. No, the first point that you made about a baby boomer generation, for example, were they acting in the same way or had the same challenges as a millennial generation does today? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but that's where my preconceived idea comes in, that I think probably so. Just obviously technology makes a difference, but we're all kind of on that same life journey rather than trying to label ourselves as being something different.
Absolutely. I think we can't lose the nature of individuality either. Again, going back to that idea that when you hear the label or you see a person of a certain age and you expect them to behave a certain way or value something because of that age, that could be a dangerous thing, because there is a lot of variability within age groups, within individuals in age groups. And so we want to make sure we get to know the person as an individual as we're bringing them on board of the organization, as we're training them, as we're coaching them, as we're mentoring them.
Yeah. Jim, you mentioned about, some of the the work that you did that led up to this about the changing workforce 2020, I think it was. But you mentioned again, just on the last answer that you gave around how the workforce trends are changing over the next decade or are likely to. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your thoughts on what the workforce you think will look like and how that would impact the procurement leader, the procurement practitioner today.
Well, I think everybody recognizes that the workforce is changing, and this whole recognition of the change goes back probably 10 to 15 years by some good work that was coming out of the academic environment, identifying the change in demographics. But I personally think that we had this event in 2008, the economic downturn, that had a profound influence not only on the workforce but on procurement. Let me explain. Mm-hmm. The profound impact on the workforce was when I was growing up in business, there was a senior person, a junior person, and the freshman person. Yep. And there was this natural progression through an organization. In 2008, the decision was made to basically take most of the workforce reduction out of that middle group, the junior group. That left us with the senior people, the folks that were really needed, the ones that knew how to do things. Yeah. And I think most businesses didn't want to lose their edge in attracting up-and-coming talent. But, excuse me for using a label, that Gen X demographic in the middle was decimated, mm-hmm. and really hasn't been replaced. Only 1 in 4 of those positions have been replaced based upon statistics. And as a result, you have this missing piece in the workforce going forward. For any workforce, be it technical, operational, whatever, that's creating issues because now you have a wider chasm to cross when you're conveying information and exchanging information between the senior folks and the up-and-coming emerging professionals. Mm-hmm. And there's not that bridge in the middle to liaise to make that happen. So that's the impact on the workforce in general. The impact on procurement was in 2008 with the downturn. There was a lot of reverting back to let's take cost out of the equation, and supply management, supply chain organizations will always be measured on cost reduction. We'll never be able to get away from that. Right. It would be great if people would look at them from a value perspective, but that's not going to happen. So this pivotal event in 2008 created 2 scenarios. One, the impact on the workforce going forward, and then the pushback of procurement giving up some of the gains that it had realized over the previous 2 decades from the Krellich paper in Harvard Business Review that purchasing must become supply management. I always look at that event as being pivotal. Does that answer your question, Phil? Or
I think so. One of the things I guess as a follow-up is, so we find ourselves now in this position where we have that gap. And we talked earlier about the fact that the generational labeling, isn't particularly helpful. It's more around communication. I think it's more about understanding each other, perhaps empathizing with each other based on our experiences, rather than just saying it's Generation X versus baby boomers versus millennials. I'm interested in what do you think a procurement leader can do, kind of on the ground to foster that greater, I don't know whether it's a spirit of partnership, whether it's enhancing knowledge transfer. I'm not quite sure what it is that they can do, but I'd love for them to be able to take something away as they listen to this, to say, you know what, I need to kind of approach my strategy a little bit differently in terms of the different kind of age groups rather than a generational label within my team, so that everyone's kind of working more closely together.
I mean, I think having... One thing is this, as a leader, it's about having an open mind as the people that you're working with. Mm-hmm. And again, not necessarily just relying on what you think that person's going to want out of their work environment, not necessarily just assuming who that person is and how they work, but really getting to know that person one-on-one as the individual.
Yeah.
Sort of going to some of my earlier comments, but getting to know that person one-on-one as the individual, to understand their own unique strengths, their own unique motivators, their own unique desires out of the workplace, things that give them satisfaction. And so that's important. And, it sounds maybe easy to do. That's hard to do when you're managing a large group of people, or when you're working with a lot of people. The next thing is to foster a culture of, I think, acceptance of all ages.
Yeah.
Changing a culture in many organizations can be difficult to do because, a manager or a leader can talk about values, but until they actually live the values, until they actually model the way, to quote, I guess, Kuzes and Posner, it's, you really need to change sort of the assumptions, the mindset of the organization. And the best way to do that is sort of mentoring others in the organization to be accepting of all individuals of various ages. Beyond that, I think there are a lot of strategies that we found in my research that people can improve intergenerational interactions, all the way from, focusing on communication style, whether it's the communication channel that you're using, whether it's the types of things you talk about, whether it's even language usage.
Yeah.
The types of perhaps words you're using to communicate an idea, and to focus on what that other individual speaks, what they're most comfortable with. That's one thing. Even doing things like impression management, is an important thing, I think, to improve interaction.
What's impression management? And maybe this is a simple question. It's just not a term that I'm familiar with.
Sure. So impression management is sort of, it kind of is what it sounds like. It's managing your image in essence.
Right. Okay.
I always joke around. So, like you were saying with your story, a lot of the jobs that I found myself in, I've been one of the younger individuals in the workplace. And it's one of those things where, you want to make sure that you don't want to fall into those stereotypes or confirm those stereotypes. You want to, in other words, as a younger professional, you don't want people thinking that you're necessarily entitled, or that you're lazy, or that you can't contribute. And so a couple of ways of managing an impression. One would be just to get results.
Yeah.
So, as basic as it sounds, it really does work for some folks that are trying to improve intergenerational interactions, specifically individuals who are on the younger side, is to actually do something, do your job and do it well. And that's going to break some of those barriers down of some stereotypes. Additionally, I always joke around whenever I present on this topic. Whenever I became an academic, I grew a beard and I started wearing glasses.
Right.
And the reason being is it made me look a little bit older. In the profession that I find myself in right now, sometimes age is related to maturity, related to experience, related to knowledge and skill. And so I wanted to portray that. So part of impression management from that tactic for me, and I've seen others use this tactic as well, and I'm not saying this is the best tactic, by the way, but it does work in some situations, I think, is to manage the way you look, from my perspective, to try and make myself look older to, in essence, make it look like I fit the role.
Right. Interesting.
In my case, listening to Mike's comments about where we are, he used the term mentor. Yeah. And that's a term that I use very cautiously because I have a lot of reverence for the term, in that I was very fortunate. I had excellent mentors when I was growing up in business. I was not the best of emerging professionals. I could go off wildly sometimes. But here's what all of my mentors had in common, and I've been thinking about this more and more. They were very observant. They watched what was going on. They listened. They listened not only to me when I spoke with them, but they listened to all of the other dialogue surrounding something that I was doing or a project that I was engaged in. They were patient within limits. I had very firm managers, and that's the last part of it. They were very firm when they needed to be. Now, the last two transformations that I was engaged in were really representative of a mix of emerging professionals and people with tremendous experience, lots and lots of experience. And the leadership in both of those cases was very much different, but very much the same as I just described.
Yeah.
They listened, they observed, they were patient, and they were firm when they needed to be. The major difference between the two was in the first transformation, where we had much success, but it was attributable to the people. It was a case of the leaders stepping back and letting things follow their natural course. Mm-hmm. In the second transformation, we had an equal amount of success, or the folks who were engaged had an equal amount of success. But the leader was very much different. This one was a visionary and knew where she wanted to take the transformation, and was enthusiastic about it, vocal. But they both ended in about the same place with successful transformations, coming from two different places. But those four attributes that I mentioned, observe, listen, patience, and be firm, were evident in both of them.
As you talk about mentors, it just reminds me of a guest that I had very early on the show. It was Tanya Siri of Procurious. It was the first time that I interviewed her. I think it was like episode 2 or episode 3. But Tanya mentioned the notion, for her, something that was helpful was, she called it a millennial mentor. But the idea being that, you're in a leadership position, obviously more experienced, but kind of flipping the mentoring model on its head. So, when you think of mentoring, it's often a younger, less experienced person being mentored by an older, more experienced person. Well, perhaps there's things that the younger people can teach, somebody in her situation. I'm interested if you think, if that sounds like it's something that leaders could pursue, is trying to get a mentor that's perhaps younger, that's but that comes to things from a different point of view, a different perspective. When we look back and talked about that, some of these differences, do exist, but a lot of it is around familiarity to technology, for example. If something like that is something that you would recommend folks to pursue.
I would, but I would communicate it a bit differently. Mm-hmm. Managers, especially senior managers, and this is not a criticism, this is, again, an observation, want to demonstrate that they know what they're talking about and they have a command of the situation. And that means that in a scenario like you described, you have to step back and say, I can learn a lot from the emerging professional. And if you can recognize that, and if you can be strong within yourself and make that move, there's a tremendous amount to be gained, not only from the new information. For example, the one transformation that I spoke of, the emerging professionals were just wizards with spreadsheets and databases, and we all know that information is power when you're working in the supply management, the supply chain space. This team was just the best at it. And what we had to do, for those of us who were senior to this process, we had to step back and say, have at it, guys. Show us what you can do.
Right.
And I use the term guys very generically, by the way. Just run with it. Do your thing and learn from them. And that takes a certain amount of self-confidence to say, okay, fine, I'm going to learn from this new group, and they are incredibly talented. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing graduate out of the universities nowadays with degrees in supply management, supply chain, these folks are very capable. And as I said before, what you have to do is be willing to learn from them. You don't know everything just because I'm the one with the experience.
Right.
And I guess, whenever I think about mentorship, I absolutely think different age groups should mentor each other. Mentorship isn't really a one-way street. It's about mutual mentorship. And I think when you're thinking about who could be a mentor, as you're selecting a mentor, it should be someone perhaps that has had experiences that you want to have. That can take should be very strategic, that can take your career in a direction you would like it to go. So as you're selecting a mentor, it should be with somebody who has had experiences you would like to have, or sort of has a strength in an area that you're not strong in. So you can learn from that person and develop from that person. And so regardless of age, that's number one, what I think people need to look for as they're choosing a mentor. Regarding, having a millennial mentor, again, I'm cautious about using that label, given that it should be based on what you want to learn from that person. Yeah. But, I do think that a more mature worker can learn from a newer person in the workforce. And I always think I love the movie The Intern. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the movie.
No.
But Intern, it's a comedy. Yeah. But it actually is, I think, a somewhat realistic portrayal of mutual mentorship between Anne Hathaway's character, who is of a younger generation, and Robert De Niro's character, who is of an older generation. And it's a good portrayal how, the one character is not just learning from the other; they're both learning from each other as a result of this relationship. And I think that's really the best type of mentorship that you can have. And so, as you're talking about selecting a mentor, it should be someone that should help you grow, regardless of age. But also, that person's probably growing from being your mentor as well.
Right. And you often don't think of that. I think when I put myself in my shoes when I've been very fortunate to have some really great mentors, but I always see it as being they're helping me, not necessarily that I'm helping them. And maybe there's something that comes with that as well in terms of then it makes me not want to waste their time, but I don't necessarily look at it as they may be benefiting from doing this, and learning things that I can share as well.
Absolutely.
I know that we're running out of time. This is a topic that I was really interested to talk about because I'm really passionate about the fact that we do so much labeling, especially around generations, that I just don't think are necessary, that they're fair, that necessarily reflect kind of reality. So first of all, just thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have one last question, and this is what I'll ask individually. And Mike, I guess I will ask you first, and then Jim, if you want to answer as well. What's the one thing that you want listeners to actually take away from today's conversation more than anything else when it actually comes to the notion of intergenerational differences?
There is a lot of variability within a generation. Mm-hmm. So to your point, to just assume that somebody is a certain way based on their age really doesn't work so well all the time. It's really getting to know the individual. Yeah. And so the most important thing to me is to get to know, go beyond the noise of the stereotypes, beyond what, you may have read in an article or in a book, and think about who that person is as an individual that you're interacting with, and their own unique individual skill sets, who they are as a person. And I think it's challenging because we're bombarded, as Jim said, with, a lot of information about age groups, about generational labels. And, when we were presenting in Orlando, someone asked us, well, how do you know what's accurate about generations if I read something or what's inaccurate? As I was thinking about that, it's really like anytime you read anything, you hear the news, you read an article about any topic, you want to ask yourself, is there data presented here that I can draw the same conclusion as this person reported data? If that's not there, and you can't draw the same conclusion, you want to ask yourself, what's the credibility of this piece of information? Is there some bias inherent with this person that's reporting this information? And that's how you kind of can sort some of the clutter about what's real about generations versus maybe what's more anecdotal or what's more perhaps exaggerated. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to do. And it helps us then, once we can filter some of that out, to truly see people as individuals.
In our presentation in Orlando, made a reference to President Kennedy's address to Yale University in 1962. And in it, he basically calls attention to the need to disenthrall ourselves from the inheritance of truisms and stereotypes. And he challenged us to recognize that we're dealing with an essential confrontation with a new reality. And that is where we are. The world is changing. It's changing dramatically. And because of the demographic shift that's taking place, this is a challenge that must be dealt with now. And it can't be postponed, and it can't be ad hoc. I mentioned earlier in this discussion that this applies to organizations large and small. And yes, some large organizations have talent management strategies that they're working on diligently, and that's good. My big concern is for the small organizations out there that are going to find themselves on the short end of expertise and ability. And it's just not fair to put a whole new generation into a position where they have to learn the hard way rather than from the benefit of the experience of the generation before them. This passing along of knowledge has always been important. In fact, I had mentioned before that my mentors were all good ones. They all had one other thing in common. All of those mentors, and I don't know why, I don't know if they worked with one another, but all of them had me make a common promise, and that was that when they showed me something that I could use again, that I had to share it with someone else. I had to make that promise to them that I would share what they taught me. And that's what I'm doing now.
Well, I have one final question. I know, again, we're coming up to the top of the hour here. I'd love for listeners who are interested in just digging a little bit deeper into the topic and perhaps connecting with you both personally, if I could just, if you could share where they could find you, perhaps if there's any additional information, again, you want to share, what I'll do is I'll link up to that in the show notes. So you don't need to give me any complex URLs or anything like that. But if there's anywhere that, let's say, listeners can connect with you, just let me know and we'll include that in the show notes.
Sure. In my case, they'd just go to LinkedIn. That would be the easiest place to find me. And it's Jim Baehr. I think it is actually James M. Baehr. Now you're making me think here for a minute, Phil. It's out there. You'll find me, and then that'll link you to the work that I'm doing for my own organization and some of the stuff that I've published and worked with others on.
Perfect.
LinkedIn is great for me as well. Just go to LinkedIn and then search for me, Michael Urick, MichaelUrick. Facebook, you can do facebook.com/UrickMJ, URICKMJ. You can find me there. My email is michael.urick@stvincent.edu, and I also have a blog on St. Vincent's website as well.
Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll definitely link up to all those in the show notes. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/generations. That's artofprocurement.com/generations. So, Jim, Mike, one last time, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.